Hello everybody, it's your boy the Chaotic One, and welcome back to a brand new video. Today we are doing the Prime Minister Timeline Episode 7. I know it's been a while, but I'm here now, so better late than never. We're going through the years of 1914 through 1934. Starting off in 1914, we have the Tampico Affair, pretty much setting up this big... Well, what happened in our timeline is that, the U.S. got involved with the Mexican Revolution, a big government change, I believe anyway. And it pretty much started here with U.S. interference here in the Tampico Affair due to several U.S. naval soldiers being, brought in as hostages by the Mexican government over territory dispute in the ocean, something like that. However, in this timeline, the U.S. government doesn't interfere despite this because there's such a split amongst ideologies in the Parliament or Congress that nothing can really get agreed on. So the U.S. doesn't really get involved here, and the hostages are brought back to the U.S. via diplomacy, which is the best they could do at the time. And Prime Minister Hadley, Herbert Hadley, is the Prime Minister currently. He signs the Federal Trade Commission Act, essentially establishes the Federal Trade Commission, which helps pretty much boosts trade in the United States due to this commission. In 1915, I know this looks weird, but the 13th Amendment is ratified, and that is women's suffrage. A lot of amendments didn't get passed in this timeline due to a vary of reasons, but the women's suffrage is signed. Herbert Hadley did support women's suffrages in our timeline, and him being Prime Minister, he would get that done, as well as him having a majority in Congress. So he would sign this, or he would pass this amendment. He would probably have a lot of support from progressives as well, and maybe some Democrats, not likely though. But the 13th Amendment is women's suffrage in this timeline, and the U.S. does occupy Haiti due to, of course, political interests as well as financial interests. That's the whole reason why Woodrow Wilson did it in the first place. I wouldn't be surprised if Herbert Hadley did it too. There's also no second KKK, so the KKK isn't a major force in this timeline at this point in time. When, of course, I'm sure there are still like KKK-like groups in the modern day. However, it's nothing like this second wave of the Ku Klux Klan. Going on to 1916, Prime Minister Hadley does sign the Keating-Owens Act, which does restrict child labor. Of course, this is during the whole progressive push of, getting proper work hours, ending child labor. This is just one of those steps to do so. Prime Minister Hadley also signs the Merchant Marine Act, which does establish the U.S. Shipping Board, kind of gets the Marines and the Navy involved in our shipping and trade. Again, more boost to trade. The 1916 federal election does occur. Hadley is a very popular Prime Minister, and of course, he and his party, the Republicans, do end up gaining seats, 19 seats where they get 253. The Progressives, led by, I believe, Albert Cummins, takes a bump in seats as they lose 3 seats, now 174. And the Federalists, led by Thomas Marshall, they lose 16 seats, now at 35. Herbert Hadley is reelected as Prime Minister with a majority government once more. Heading into 1917, the New York City food riot of 1917 has occurred. In that last election, Republicans don't do very well with agricultural-heavy districts, and of course they didn't hit the cities yet. Now they do, as of course there's a lack of city due to, the agriculture issues going on in the early 1900s, or late 1910s, you get what I mean. The Zimmerman telegram is intercepted, so these next series of events kind of fix the agriculture issue as it typically does in wartime. Prime Minister Hadley, due to this, is declaring war on Germany, Austria, Hungary, and everyone on that side of the spectrum, due to, Germany trying to get Mexico to invade the United States, of course, which might not have happened considering U.S. isn't getting involved in the Mexican Revolution. I'll leave that up to you. Prime Minister Hadley does sign the Selective Service Act, which does establish the draft in the United States. However, there is no Espionage Act. The Sedition Act in 1918, I believe, is moderated and does include parts of the Espionage Act. However, it's nothing near crazy that Wilson did sign and pass. There's a lot less pushback with this one. 1918, the time zones and daylight savings are established. Prime Minister Hadley, as we said before, does sign the Sedition Act in 1918, a very different act, a different piece of legislation, which the Sedition Act in 1918, that stays in put, but there's a lot of more of a moderate form of the Espionage Act thrown in there as well. So, there's a lot of things. So Eugene Debs isn't being thrown into jail. That's one of the big things, people can't be thrown into prison with this piece of legislation. Of course, World War I does end in the same way as it did IRL. Hadley and Wilson would probably both have a very similar strategy involved in the war, so don't expect us to be in there longer, less, pretty much the same. Going on to 1919, Prime Minister Hadley does sign the Treaty of Versailles. Now, it's hard to say what kind of influence he has in that meeting. Wilson had a very, he forced his influence over the other leaders pretty much. We had the 14 points. The League of Nations, which was pretty much useless and pointless. Considering the United States, rejected going into the League of Nations, mostly because they didn't go by Wilson's vision, as it says. So it's kind of hard to say what kind of influence Hadley would have. It's very tough to say, but I'll let you use your imagination on that one. There was also a steel strike in the year of 1919. This is very typical. Manufacturing and trade is going to be all flunky, so, wages and prices, selling, it's going to be, taking a hit, and that's what's going to cause a strike. Also, no Prohibition Amendment. The Prohibition movement was mostly supported by progressives, and of course Hadley is not a progressive. He's more of a left-leaning liberal, not so much on the progressive spectrum, because, Republicans are still liberal up in this point in time. In 1920, the first Red Scare does begin. Of course, this is going to happen as the rise of communism in Russia is going to, affect the rest of the country. Of course, the United States does enter into a post-war recession into 1920 and 1921. I said that right? 1920 and 1921? Something like that. We also get the 1920 federal election. It's all over the place. Of course, there is a Red Scare. However, progressives under James Cox does be able to manage themselves well, especially with the Depression hitting the Republicans' doorstep, which is kind of why James Cox lost in our timeline, is because Wilson and his administration and the Democrats were being hit with this Depression. And, of course, the fact that Wilson wasn't just liked all that much. It was kind of incidental how he won 2 terms, as well as first it was a war, and then it was a two-way split between Taft and Roosevelt. But there were progressives under James Cox from Ohio. They win 209 seats, gaining them with a gain of 35 seats. Republicans led by someone I'm somehow related to, apparently, Warren G. Harding at 192 seats. Republicans lose 61 seats from this election. And the Federalists under J.T. Pritchard of North Carolina, that's my state, they lose 1 seat now at 34 seats. James Cox is elected prime minister. However, him and his party, the Progressives, have a minority government. You need 218 seats for a majority. They only have 209. Heading into 1921, Prime Minister Cox does sign the Shepard-Towner Act, which is child care funding. Hell, if I had to guess, we probably get a much more progressive version of that. Probably a lot more spending and, just stuff you wouldn't really see in the 1920s. Probably something you would see in the 1940s. Huge whiplash from the Republicans, Federalists. However, Cox would still get it done, considering he has the majority. The Depression of 1920 to 21 does end as well. The economy is starting to look really well for themselves now. And, of course, due to a minority government, politics be politicking, Prime Minister James Cox fails a vote of confidence despite being very popular with the U.S. citizens. Of course, there's also no Emergency Quota Act. This did restrict immigration from Eastern Europe into the United States. Cox did not support this, so this wouldn't be something that would happen. Going on to 1922, the only thing we've got to worry about is the federal election, which is a massive blowback to Republicans and Federalists. Kind of backfires on them for failing Cox at a vote of confidence. The Progressives, they gained 76 seats, which they should have kind of guessed was going to happen, considering he's pretty popular. They have 285 seats now. The Republicans, led by Leonard Wood of New Hampshire, they lose 77 seats, now 114 seats. And the Federalists, led by Howard Sutherland, they gain 2 seats, now at 36 seats. James Cox is reelected as Prime Minister, this time with a majority government. In 1923, there is nothing noteworthy to speak about. 1924, the big thing we have to talk about is the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. This pretty much just gives Native Americans who were born in U.S. territories in the United States, or Native American designated territories, I guess you could say, they're given just full-blown U.S. citizenship. Cox did this. I think Calvin Coolidge did this in our timeline. I believe it was Coolidge. It was either him or Harding. I don't think Harding was alive at this point, so I think it was Coolidge. Also, there's no Asian Exclusion Act. This is pretty much restricting Asian immigration as well. For some reason, Coolidge, Harding, Republican just had a fucking... I'm not going to say what I was going to say, but I'm pretty sure you understand what I'm about to. 1925, there's nothing noteworthy. In 1926, Prime Minister James Cox does sign the Air Commerce Act, which does license pilots and planes. I guess gives them that U.S. licensing. Don't really understand this that much, though it was really important to the U.S. Air Force, so that's why I got to include it. We also have the 1926 federal election, 4 years after Cox's re-election. The Progressives end up gaining seats once again. Cox still remains very popular with the U.S. citizens. and he gets at 295 seats. Republicans being led by Theodore Burton. They lose 9 seats, now 105. Federalists are still being led by Howard Sutherland. They kept him because they ended up gaining seats after, multiple failings in the previous years. However, they lose seats again, just one though, at 35 seats. James Cox is reelected as prime minister with a majority government. However, it's pretty much clear he's probably going to end up calling for another special election so we can keep the tradition going of only serving 8 years. In 1927, just as we said, he calls for a special election, stating he's going to be resigning in 1929, where the new prime minister would be elected or inaugurated, in 1928, we look at that election. There were progressives. They lose a bunch of seats. However, they keep their majority as Charles Curtis of Kansas. Him and the progressives end up winning 265 seats. They lose 30 seats, however, just, due to the changing of tides. Of course, independents switching their votes to Federalist Republicans, mostly Republicans under Herbert Hoover, as they win 137 seats, gaining 32. And the Federalists under Al Smith continue to lose more. That whole anti-Catholic quota is still hitting them hard, as Smith wins 33 seats, losing 2 for the Federalists. Charles Curtis is elected prime minister under a majority government, continuing that streak for the progressives. Going into 1929, that streak kind of ends as a string of bad luck just hits the progressives and Charles Curtis. The Wall Street crash of 1929, as well as the Great Depression. Most of this, if not all of it, being caused by World War I and the U.S. involvement there. And even if the U.S. didn't have involvement, I'm pretty sure it would have happened either or. Nothing noteworthy happens in 1930. However, there is no Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Progressives were very much against tariffs at this point in time, something that would change later on. But as of right now, they're very much against that. It was mostly a Democrat thing, more of the right-wing side. Very strange, I know. Going on to 1931, Prime Minister Curtis does sign legislation legalizing gambling nationwide. I used to have a name for this, but it's been so long, I kind of forgot what it was. So if you remember, tell me down in the comments. So this happens again. Curtis was very much up for legalizing gambling nationwide. It was something that made it very popular in Nevada. So, as Nevada was the voice of legalizing gambling. And of course, this does booster the economy. This is a lot of money going into the economy now. Is it enough? Not really. Of course, the Depression is still going to hit hard, but this one kind of takes, something off, I guess. Going on to 1932, Prime Minister Curtis does sign the Revenue Act of 1932, which is a gas tax, which only just makes them more unpopular. However, this is more money being stimulated to the economy, as we found out much, much later on, as we head into the 1932 federal election. Of course, many people would think, wait, since he's so unpopular due to the Depression, wouldn't there be a special election? You would think, but no, progressives kind of save him from that. Of course, there are some progressives who vote against his confidence. However, he still has enough votes to survive a confidence vote, because, politics. Republicans end up winning this election, of course. Republicans being led by Joseph France of Maryland. They win 234 seats, gaining 97 from 4 years ago. The progressives under Charles Curtis lose seats in the triple digits, something we don't see a lot in any timeline. They are now at 164 seats. They lose 101. The Federalists under John Garner, they win seats again. It seems like the Federalists are going to be this moderate option going forward, but Garner with 37 seats, gaining 4 for the Federalists. However, Joseph France is elected prime minister with a majority government. Of course, not this huge government. Let's say, if the House today got 234 seats, it's a pretty decent-sized majority in the U.S. Congress, but not, massive. That would be 240, 250, 260 seats. So, there you go. Going on 1933, again, I know this all looks weird. It looks weird to me too, I know. The 14th Amendment is ratified, which in our timeline is the 20th Amendment, which is changing inauguration dates. This happened IRL for, I'm not sure why. I think it's I remember. It was to, lessen the lame duck period, because there was a feeling in the day that going from the election from November all the way to March changed that. It was just too long of a lame duck period for the current president to go in and change things for the next president. So make it harder for them, so they just lessened that by 2 months. Make things harder for the new president, which, something that would have happened a lot nowadays. Trump would have done everything to make Biden's life harder if the lame duck period was in March. Imagine that. Prime Minister France does also sign something that, Prohibition, another amendment was passed in 1933. It was the 21st Amendment, which ended Prohibition. However, instead of that, he's going to sign the Revenue Act of 1933, which is just increasing taxes on alcohol, something that, hits his popularity a bit, but does bolster the economy a little bit. Prime Minister France also signs the Federal Securities Act, which is just the Federal Trade Commission security via registration. Kind of just adds in an extra length of security there to bolster trade. And a lot of things don't happen in this year that happened IRL under Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal. France wasn't this big New Deal Republican that a lot of people, expect from Republicans, considering left-leaning and all that. The Philippines aren't giving independence. Republicans in this timeline are very much wanting to keep the Philippines for themselves. There is no Agriculture Adjustment Act, so the agricultural situation in the United States isn't fixed as of right now. There is no Tennessee Valley Authority, and there's no Civil Works Administration. A lot of New Deal Act stuff that does not happen in this year. 1934, Prime Minister France does sign the Gold Reserve Act, which kind of pretty much confiscates all the gold from the U.S. Federal Reserve and hits into the Department of Treasury, which is a temporary boost to get us from, I guess you could say, depression to recession, but people are still going to call it a depression, so just let it be known. And this also does increase gold prices when, you sell and buy. Prime Minister France also signs the Securities Exchange Act. This establishes the Securities and Exchange Commission. And the U.S. occupation of Haiti does end, so we're not spending money in Haiti anymore. It's being sent back to the United States, if we don't fuck up the withdrawal, which that doesn't happen. Thank you guys so much for watching. Sorry that it took so long to get out, but oh well. Thank you guys so much for watching. This is the Chaotic One saying peace. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.